Let me welcome you. My name is David Bisgrove. I am the pastor of the congregation that meets in this building on Sundays, and we are thrilled to be able to co-host with the Center for Faith and Work this event tonight. But before I introduce the guests and set the table for how we're going to go, let me just orient us to the evening this way. A little over 150 years ago, America was being torn apart by what we call a civil war. It was a fracture that was rooted in deep differences that threatened the very nature of what it meant to be a nation defined by the phrase e pluribus unum, out of many one. And as you also may know, that crisis elicited from the fertile mind and imagination of Abraham Lincoln words that have become canonized as American scripture. Lincoln wrote this: "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature." Now, I'm in no way suggesting that the current state of our lack of civility in the public square matches the horror of the conflict over which Abraham Lincoln presided, but his words do find resonance with us in that despite this current cultural moment, we are not enemies, we are friends. That we share Lincoln's optimism that we can live out of the better angels of our nature and more fully embody e pluribus unum. But why here? Why a church? Some of you may be thinking, aren't Christians part of the problem? And I would suggest that although there have been many times when, as Mr. Kristof actually rightly noted in his recent article, religions too often don't resemble their founder, in our case Jesus, that the church, Christians, have an important role to play if we're to see each other as friends instead of enemies. From the earliest days, Christians went to the marketplace, what the Greeks and the Romans called agora. And that was a place that not only traded in commercial goods, but it traded in ideas as well. And Christians were part of that marketplace. In other words, the Christian community has always been a public utility for the common good in which we went to listen and learn and engage and challenge and serve the community. So let me just suggest 3 ways as we get started in which Christians can approach the public square that help us shape a more civil conversation by embodying a disposition that is at the core of our faith and of our founder, that qualities, I think, regardless of what you may believe tonight about the church or about Christianity, I think we would all agree are critical if we're going to have civility in the public square, and they are humility, grace, and hope. Because humility is an antidote to discourse that too often stubbornly is convinced of its own position and too resistant to change. But humility allows us to admit that we are part of the problem, and then therefore opens up dialogues where listening becomes far more important than speaking. And grace is an antidote to the discourse that demonizes and confers the status of enemy on those with whom we disagree. But grace liberates us from the need to be right, and it liberates us from the need to feel superior, and therefore it creates in us love and generosity towards those with whom we disagree. And then hope, which is an antidote to discourse rooted in this nostalgic longing for some past era. It's what Terry Eagleton in his book Culture calls this paradise that we have lost. And that nostalgia can quickly devolve into fear and cynicism and indifference about life in general. But hope instead allows us to envision and work together for a future where one day swords will be beaten into plowshares, and justice and righteousness will flow like a river forever. So our goal tonight is, among other things, to have a conversation marked by humility, grace, and hope that in the end will strengthen our bonds of affection and will remind us that we are not enemies, but we are friends. So, to that end, this is what we're going to do the rest of the night. I'm going to invite soon Nicholas Kristof to come up. He's going to be followed by John Inazu. They're each going to give a talk. And then there's going to be a mediated and moderated discussion, which you can participate in. You can see, I think, behind me and also in your program. You can text your questions in, 646-801-0239, so you can be part of the conversation, and then we'll close. So that's the way the evening is going to go. So let me just introduce Nick and John before I invite him up. Nicholas Kristof, who is our first speaker, many of you know, has been a columnist for the New York Times since 2001. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his coverage both in Tiananmen Square and the genocide in Darfur, along with many other humanitarian awards such as the Anne Frank Award and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He grew up on a farm in Oregon, graduated from Harvard, studied law at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and then studied Arabic in Cairo. And with his wife, Cheryl Woodan, he has written several books, most recently A Path Appears, and their last book, Half the Sky, was a #1 bestseller. He's going to be followed by our second speaker, John Inazu, who's professor of law and religion at Washington University in St. Louis, a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He teaches courses in criminal law, law and religion, and the First Amendment. His scholarship focuses on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and related issues of political and legal theory. And John, as some of you know, is the author of Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Differences. And when John finishes, they're all going to come up on stage and sit in the chairs behind me. They'll be joined by Dr. Tim Keller, who's the founding pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church, for a discussion moderated by Stephanie Summers, who's the CEO of the Center for Public Justice in Washington, D.C., a nonpartisan Christian civic education and public policy organization that promotes God's good purpose for our political community. So without further ado, it is my honor to invite to the stage Mr. Nicholas Kristof. Will you welcome him, please?
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much. It seems the perfect time to have a discussion about civility in the public square, given that nationally we're having an incredibly civil dialogue about politics, But I do think that at this time, I tip my hat to Redeemer for, I think, trying to not only hold this conversation, but also hold all of our own feet to the fire and try to model behavior that really is needed. So I salute you for that. I do want to say that, I think there's a natural tendency to think, this is all the fault of Twitter or the internet or today's candidates. But actually, I think incivility has roots that go back about as far as democracy itself. And I wasn't quite reporting then, but apparently in ancient Athens, people were making the most vile insults about each other. And certainly, in the early part of American history, as you probably know, the election of 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams was renowned for its viciousness. It makes 2016 even perhaps seem a little bit tame. I was just looking up some of the statements from 1800, and Jefferson's camp accused John Adams of having a hideous hermaphroditical character. Adams' people in turn said that Jefferson was a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father. Adams' folks said that Jefferson was in favor of teaching murder, rape, adultery, and incest in schools. But Jefferson eventually triumphed by essentially hiring a dirty tricks team, which went around trying to convince people, and to some degree successfully, that if elected, Adams would start a war with France. And so this kind of incivility has deep roots, and you can look through American history and you see echoes of it over and over. And I think in part, this has to do with kind of who we are and some natural human tendencies. Evolutionary biologists say that there's a human tendency to almost instantaneously, even with young children, determine whether somebody is essentially my team or the other team, my tribe or the other team, my guy or the other guy. And so we take various shortcuts to figure that out. Maybe it's race, maybe it's clothing, whatever it may be, but we make these decisions. And I do think that a lot of our problems within civility have to do with this tendency to otherize, if you will, to otherize people based on race or religion, national origin, the way they look, maybe immigration status, and that once we've otherized people, it becomes very easy then to form invidious conclusions about them, to make insulting comments about them, and to dehumanize them. And one of the problems, I think, has been that on top of all these other ways in which we otherize people, we're also otherizing people now based on politics and on identity. And we're sorting ourselves out as a country so that we're less likely to know and have friends and be neighbors of people who have very different views or are different. Today, about half of the counties in the country are going to vote in a landslide for either Clinton or Trump, about half of the counties. Back in 1976, it was 20%. And so we're much more likely to be surrounded by people who are like-minded, who are at a similar socioeconomic level, who kind of think like us. For Clinton supporters, it's perhaps quite likely that you don't know a lot of Trump supporters, maybe you don't know a Trump supporter. For Trump supporters, it may well be that you don't know any Clinton supporters, or not very many. And in that context, I do think it becomes really easy to otherize. And we also know there's some evidence that when we're surrounded by like-minded people, we become even more so. Cass Sunstein at Harvard did a really interesting study of judges and how they ruled. And he found that when liberal judges were empaneled with other liberal judges, they became more liberal. And when conservative judges were empaneled with other conservative judges, they in turn became more conservative. And essentially we've done, and that, these are incredibly smart, well-trained people. And as a country, I think we've gone through a similar process. We are empaneled, if you will, with people who are increasingly like us. And I think that tends to compound whatever our own views are. And then there's the media world, my own domain. In contrast to Europe, the American news media evolved essentially along principles of wire services. And wire services wanted to have subscribers in Democratic newspapers and in Republican papers. So the principle was you'd write down the middle so that you'd have a bigger market, so that both liberal and conservative papers would subscribe to you. And so in contrast to Europe, where you tended to have socialist newspapers and conservative newspapers, you didn't tend to have that so much in this country. Well, that has changed. And increasingly, everybody has figured out that there is a real market for liberal news or conservative news, and abundant evidence of selection bias, that we tend to want news that isn't going to question our prejudices, but is going to confirm our prejudices. And this is, again, I think, a natural human trait that internet and TV can now cater to. And it's not just a matter of conservatives watching Fox and liberals watching MSNBC, but I think more broadly now you're getting these various alternative news, in air quotes, sites that really present incredibly scurrilous information that denigrates people, that is often racist, that is really incredibly vicious. The BuzzFeed did a fantastic article a few days ago, which I commend to you if you haven't seen it, where they looked at a week's worth of articles on alt-right, alt-left sites and on mainstream sites. And what they found was that 20% of the news, so to speak, on the liberal sites was completely fake. Really didn't have any much basis in reality. 40% of the news on the alt-right sites was that way too, and I must say it often had a real racial or racist element to it. It's really worth checking out some of these sites if you haven't done it. And like the Daily Eagle, for example, I just discovered this weekend, and is really depressing to look at. You're much better off with the New York Times. But the upshot is there was a scholar at MIT, Nicholas Negroponte, who wrote years ago about the dangers of developing a media product called the Daily Me. And that's kind of what we've developed. We all have our own daily me that we absorb and get, and I think it both reinforces our prejudices and makes it easier to dehumanize and condemn people who think differently. And so in that context, let me talk a little bit about faith and religion, which I think has also played a role in all of this. In, I think, beginning, it seems to me it dates back to the 1970s, and I'll probably offend just about everybody on every possible point of view, but journalists are good at doing that. I think that part of this was when the moral majority or the conservative evangelicals began to focus on some of the values issues, and gays in particular. And I've got to say that I think that left a bitter taste in, I think they were on the wrong side of history there. And as somebody who covered AIDS in particular, I found it completely outrageous to have people who should be providing helping hands instead pointing fingers. In the words of Anita Bryant, referring to gays as human garbage, and saying that AIDS was sent by God to punish gays in ways that impeded a public health response to HIV/AIDS. And I think that resulted, I think that hugely damaged how conservative evangelicals, and to some extent all evangelicals, were perceived by the liberal end of the perspective and the more secular end of the chain. And I think that in turn, liberals became, if you will, intolerant of Christians and especially evangelicals. So you had, it seems to me, a certain amount of religious intolerance that has become matched more recently by irreligious intolerance. And both, to some degree, are ongoing. And I find this so frustrating because on so many of the issues that I care deeply about, I see secular groups doing fantastic work. And I see religious groups doing superb work. And yet, because of this God gulf, because of this distrust, because they just think the worst of the other, they don't cooperate. And when they don't cooperate, then the winners are poverty and illiteracy, disease. And on some occasions, people have been willing to try to bridge that gap and trust and become a little more civil in their cooperation. And there, the results have been sometimes very successful. I think a model of that has been human trafficking. In the year 2000, there was a real effort to build a coalition between secular feminists and conservative evangelicals. And the result was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and subsequent legislation that really transformed how we see human trafficking worldwide and more recently at home. But that model hasn't been followed in other areas, and even there, I must say, it's very tenuous. And the fact that there isn't greater cooperation, I think, has really undermined things that both sides care deeply about. So how do we build bridges and move beyond this? Maybe especially about issues that we care really, really deeply about. If for liberals, it may be gay rights, or it may be a sense that the nation's social fabric is at stake, or racism, whatever else. For many conservatives, it's abortion and perception that human lives are at stake. I guess I would say that our natural impulse is often to respond to what we see as illiberal attacks or intolerance with intolerance of our own, and that putting aside everything else, I don't think it's terribly effective at changing minds. What does seem to be more effective, and there's some social psychology work on this, is to humanize the issue and frame it in very individual human terms. And that's how you build empathy and build compassion and can begin to create some of that response. I also think that when you have people actually talking to each other and seeing each other, then it becomes a lot harder to disdain people, to dehumanize them, to dismiss them. As a reporter, if I'm going to denounce somebody in my column, then I will typically give them a call and say, by the way, Secretary so-and-so, my column tomorrow is going to take a whack at you. And it forces you to be a little bit more careful, to understand that at the other end of the phone, there's a real person who probably believes deeply in their positions, can understand how you can be so wrong, and it tempers my columns just a little bit. And probably makes them less readable, but I think that instinct of actually engaging real people who one disagrees with is really important. And it may be harder to do that actually physically meeting people, but one can do it at an intellectual level. Every day, or pretty much every day, I go running, or I work out, because even though it's painful, I feel like it makes me a better person. And every day, for the same reason, I read the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And it's painful. But it does build muscles. It makes me understand different perspectives. And I do commend, that approach. When I travel, I always put the TV on to Fox News to kind of understand what I'm missing. Reinforces my decision at home to put it on CNN, but and I don't think that this has to force any of us to retreat from issues and ideas that we care very, very deeply about. I'm sure you know the Yeats line, the forgetting now. The best are full. The worst are full of passion. What are the best? The best are full. The best are. The best lack all conviction. The worst are full of passion and intensity. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. one hint, if you're ever giving a talk and you're about to summon a quote, make sure you actually have it up here. But, I think that is a problem, that often the best are wavering, are uncertain, have a humility about their convictions, while the worst lack that humility and are more likely to rush into judgment. But I do think that one can have some humility about one's views. And Sir Isaiah Berlin is the philosopher maybe that I admire the most. And he wrote about how it is possible to acknowledge, to realize that you may be wrong, that it's a complicated world, that there may be other factors or other things that will change, that not everything you believe in is going to be an eternal truth, and yet to believe in it and to act on it because it is the best information you have. And where there are issues of refugees or of genocide or racism that I cover, I realize that I may not have full information, that I may get it wrong, but it still seems to me incumbent upon one to try to mitigate those wrongs as one perceives them, and yet to try to do that in a way that acknowledges the humanity and autonomy of those with whom we disagree. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation afterward.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I've been asked to summarize a bit of my book, Confident Pluralism. And you can think of this actually, Nick in some ways embodied and described much of what I've written in book form. And so think of this as another pass at some of the same ideas. And hopefully they'll set up for us the discussion to follow. I want to thank Redeemer and also thank Stephanie and Tim and Nick for the conversation to follow. So I'm going to start with the problem that Confident Pluralism addresses in the book that I wrote. And it begins with the recognition of our deep differences about politics, race, religion, sexuality, and other matters. And what's odd about this is, although we talk about unity, and we even heard in the setup discussions about unity and our common agreement, our one nation indivisible, a more perfect union, actually much of our existence as Americans is characterized more by disagreement than it is by unity. And when we drill down, we realize that we lack agreement about the very purpose of our country, the nature of the common good, and the meaning of human flourishing. These differences pervade our backgrounds, our tastes, and our allegiances, and they affect not only what we think, but also how we think and how we see the world. So I see three responses to the challenges of difference: chaos, control, or coexistence. Chaos is ultimately not sustainable in the long term. It falls flat as a political possibility. It ultimately leads to the kind of violence that destroys lives. 15 years ago, I sat in the Pentagon as people who saw only the possibility of chaos smashed a plane into that building, and many of you in this room experienced the attacks in this city. Avoiding chaos as a political alternative is a matter of survival. Control finds its logical end in either theocracy or totalitarianism. Some people in this country are lured by this possibility of control. We have seen this recently in the nostalgia and nativism from some on the right, and we also see it in the moralistic assurances by some on the left who believe that opposing viewpoints are simply bigoted and therefore worthy of suppression. Neither chaos nor control represents the best of this country or its people. I've been writing lately about this third possibility of coexistence through what I call confident pluralism. Confident pluralism argues that we can and must live together peaceably in spite of and acknowledging our deep differences. We can do so in two ways: by insisting on legal protections that honor difference, and by choosing civility and kindness in our own relationships across difference. These two dimensions, the legal and the personal, are interrelated. The inclination to shut a certain viewpoint out of civil society begins with personal antipathy, but ends with legal prohibition, a refusal to extend protections of the law to others, and ultimately an effort to turn the law against them. The legal and personal dimensions of confident pluralism both require significant reform today. When it comes to the law, we must have the opportunity to form and sustain groups of our choosing. We need to be able to meet and to protest in public spaces. And we need fair access to some forms of government funding to sustain those possibilities. Our current understandings of the right of association, the public forum, and certain kinds of public funding are both under-theorized and under-protective. We must insist that the people who govern us honor basic constitutional principles that protect difference and dissent. But confident pluralism also depends on us and the everyday decisions we make without the constraints of law, in what we say and how we interact with others. The shortcomings of our civic practices are ours to overcome. To do so, we might focus on three aspirations, and here I will overlap with one of David's: tolerance, humility, and patience. Tolerance recognizes that for the most part, people are free to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even those that we find morally objectionable. Tolerance does not impose the fiction that all ideas are equally valid or morally harmless. It does require a practical enduring of difference. It means respecting people, aiming for fair discussion, and allowing for the space to differ about serious matters. The second aspiration is humility. Humility recognizes not only that others will find our beliefs and practices objectionable, but also that we can't always prove why we are right and they are wrong. Some of our most important beliefs stem from contested premises that others do not share. And the third aspiration is patience. Patience encourages efforts to listen, to understand, and to empathize. This does not mean that we ultimately accept other views. In fact, it might turn out that patience leads us to a deeper realization of the error or harm of an opposing viewpoint. But we ought not dismiss others before we hear even what they have to say. Confident pluralism imagines the bridges that we can build across difference, the places where we can find common ground even when we can't agree on a common good. But finding common ground begins with acknowledging the reality of our differences. Without the ability or the avenues to air real disagreement, genuine dialogue occurs less frequently, and contested assumptions go unchallenged. Tolerance becomes a demand for acceptance. Humility is supplanted by moral certainty, and patience loses to outrage. I worry that our failure to practice genuine dialogue across real differences, the kinds of things that Nick talked about, ultimately deprives us of our capacity to have such a dialogue. We see this across a range of issues, perhaps none as heated as race today. People in this country are deeply split about the causes and solutions to the racial challenges we confront, and in some cases, whether these challenges even exist. In the midst of our differences, we also confront a crisis of authority that feels relatively new. The weakening of major institutions across politics, education, the media, and religion, the demise of many national leaders in these sectors, and the rise of social media have all contributed to this crisis of authority. And the fracturing of authority and of institutions poses significant obstacles to attaining what I have called our modest unity, the minimal amount of consensus and sense of belonging that we, the people of this country, need in order to make confident pluralism possible. So is there any place for hope in this vision? Some people have accused me of assuming a naive optimism in confident pluralism. One reviewer, who was otherwise fairly positive of the book, nevertheless argued that it was, quote, doomed to immediate irrelevance because it lacked an audience that could respond to it. I don't think that's right. I hope not. Despite the many challenges ahead, I am hopeful, and one reason is that the American experiment in pluralism for all of its failures and shortcomings, has actually worked well for much of our nation's history. This is not the first time that we've confronted deep racial tensions, divergent views of morality, religious difference, or coarse rhetoric. In many ways, the success of the American political experiment has always required finding and maintaining a modest unity against great odds. We also have a lot of smart, caring, and creative people in this country and in this room. This national election season has not highlighted our best, but we ought not forget those who are doing a great deal of good outside of the spotlight. And we need to be telling each other the stories that highlight this good work, the stories that harness our collective imagination toward a shared future. Stories about surprising friendships between people who disagree about important matters. About local partnerships between religious and non-religious people in public education in cities like Portland, St. Louis, and Memphis, and about the ordinary acts of neighbors and strangers alike coming together to help flood victims in Louisiana, North Carolina, and other places. One challenge that we confront in imagining our shared future is that some people are still looking only to the past. Yuval Levin's important book, The Fractured Republic, describes the deep nostalgia from both left and right that longs for a bygone era, albeit different eras for each side, in which the world just seemed to work better. Of course, many people in this country are not interested in any kind of retrieval project. Going back to the good old days is not a good bet if your race, gender, religion, or sexuality placed you outside of the political consensus that ruled those times. This tension between those who long for the past and those who have happily transcended it is one of the inherent tensions today in a pluralistic society. The more that we recognize the actual differences among us, the less consensus we are able to assume. But this diversity of groups and ideas and beliefs comes with a big upside. It offers the possibility of better and more creative solutions from working across difference, and of navigating the challenges of pluralism without succumbing to the despair that leads to chaos or the fear that leads to control. This is, in the end, a relatively modest vision, but it is an important one. Confident pluralism does not give us the American dream, but it might help avoid the American nightmare. And that is a possibility for which we cannot lose hope. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well done, John.
Okay. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to get us started in this conversation. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, John. And thank you, Tim, for being here.
A lot of people are not used to me speaking so little. But it was a refreshing thing for me, I must say.
So I'm going to spend some time asking you guys a couple questions, and then we'll take some questions. You know, if you're formulating questions, I do have a rule for your questions, which is that they are in the form of a question. So just keep that in mind as you're writing out your text. So let's start with a definition of terms, right? We've got civility written up here large. You both brought up civility in your remarks, and this is the banner, and I know that Tim has written on the topic as well. When we're talking about civility, I'm guessing we're not just talking about being polite. So could you each start by sharing sort of your working definition of civility?
Well, I would say civility has to start with the acknowledgement of real differences. And I find, especially in the university setting where I spend most of my time, there is something that passes as civility but is actually not. It's sort of a feigned consensus or a false unity. And civility actually must begin with acknowledging the depth of our differences, but also, as I think we've both pointed to, the humanity in the other person. And so to combine an understanding of humanity with deep and really sometimes striking differences that cut to the heart of our deepest matters, and to be able to dialogue and relate across that difference. That's civility, as I understand it.
I'd say civility is partly, if you don't really have a clue to the answer to a question, you politely say to the person to your left.
And it was so civil of you to do.
I would just add to that very good answer that I think a lot of it is about listening. And that, we tend to talk at each other. I think it's a lot harder to genuinely listen to somebody say things that you disagree with, that you rebel at, that make you feel uncomfortable. But I think that listening has to be at the heart of it.
Yeah, I think we're all talking about John's first disposition, tolerance. John has rehabilitated the word for me. I thought of tolerance as a pretty wimpy word, meaning, yeah, I just won't come down your throat. But what he said is actually what you do with the Wall Street Journal opinion page, and that is you are willing to subject yourself to positions that you find somewhat painful to hear. And so if you are able to be respectful and listen regularly to people who say things that you find actually painful to hear, but you're respectful, you're listening, you're trying to learn, I think maybe that's not all civility is, but it's at least that. And if you can't do that, there's no civility.
Good. Okay, so we sometimes see that things that are sort of modeled in our public life and in our public discourse brings to life in us similar behaviors or impulses. Could you talk a little bit about, sort of if you're thinking about the kind of situation we find ourselves in, how the kind of recent erosion, maybe not the historical trajectory that you spoke of, Nick, but the recent erosion of civility has specifically affected our larger society?
Very good. One of the things that I've been thinking about this year is, I've been really horrified by what I perceive as innuendos about race or ethnicity, immigration status, religion that I find profoundly offensive coming out of this election. And I wonder how it is that these find enormous resonance among voters today. Donald Trump would, if only whites voted in this election, Donald Trump, according to the last poll I saw, would win by 11 percentage points. Among whites, he's way, way ahead. And I think back to 1964, 1965, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, and you had a willingness on the part of many working-class whites to be more inclusive, to broaden legal protections. And it does seem to me that part of the answer has to do with, if you will, with a sense of mobility and inequality. That in 1964, 65, those families were living a better life than their parents had lived. They could project that they would be living in the future better lives down the road. And so they were more willing to be inclusive. And I think that one problem today, and perhaps one reason for the tendency to otherize people, is that for an awful lot of Americans, things have stagnated, and they're not living better than they were. And it, I think, leads people to be more, since for the bottom half of the wealth distribution since 1970, the bottom half of the wealth distribution of households, there's been no increase since the 1970s. And in that context, I think people are much more likely to point fingers and to blame, to find scapegoats, to blame others. And to me, one of the lessons is that one of the things we have to do after the election to try to create a more inclusive society, to rebuild our social fabric, is also to try to recreate that sense of social mobility and opportunity and shared economic growth.
I would add maybe that the sense of fear that seems so prevalent exacerbates all of this, and people have always been afraid, but in some ways the news sources that you described and the constant barrage of media, social media, keeps us ever reminded of the fears out there, and that can build stories and narratives in our own lives. It's astounding to me that within the last year we've had the Democratic mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, and the Republican nominee for president both call for internment camps. And my dad was born in the internment camps during World War II, and as a Japanese American, I thought we were past that for good, and yet we have political rhetoric that suggests otherwise, and that feeds into a fear that people feel viscerally but then fuel upon, and that can add to this.
I love going last because I think what we're all saying is that more groups of people feel insecure. I do think that non-white people in this country have always felt insecure. They've always felt fragile. They've always felt their interests could just suddenly turn. And now, for the first time, white people actually also feel insecure. A lot of them because they are not terribly, they're not in the cosmopolitan elite, and they feel like their wages are stagnating and so on. A lot of them because it's the same reason actually that Brexit went through, that virtually everybody now feels besieged somehow. Maybe it's true. I mean, Nick said it's not just all the internet, but the internet does help everybody feel besieged. But it's almost like no one feels secure, and because of that, there's, I think, the original question was why? What is making civility harder than ever? And in some ways, there was a faux civility because the people in power threw scraps to the people who are out of power, by and large, silenced them. And today, I think, because of the people who formerly were in power now feel besieged, they're trying to flex their muscles. They're trying to get their power back. Other groups have been more empowered, and they're very frightened by it. And I think that's what's leading to all the incivility.
There was a very fine newspaper, the New York Times, that published a piece last Thursday about a Harris poll that was showing data from folks who were experiencing election-related stress that was sending them into therapy.
Not surprising.
And therapists in the article talking about how they were dealing with the challenge of election-related stress. It's interesting, Nick. I would like to ask you this particularly. You have looked at sort of broad-scale trauma, in various places where you've done work. And you sort of posited this: after the election, we're going to have to. But part of recovery from trauma, right, is some sort of concerted action, right? It's a real important step that there are meaningful actions that are taken. What are the types of actions, as you've sort of thought to yourself, what's going to come next, that you think, folks like the folks in this room might step forward on?
See, now's my turn to say.
They get to go.
I think a great deal is going to depend on how close the election is and to what extent the legitimacy of the underlying institutions are called into question. If it's close and there are fundamental doubts about whether, among many, many tens of millions of Americans, about whether the election was stolen, then, boy, that's going to be tough. If that is not the case, then I don't really know, what is possible, but I do think that there can be greater efforts at, to some degree, mitigating this problem by tremendous efforts at bipartisanship in legislation, by trying to address this issue of inequality so that all these folks who are feeling insecure and frightened, partly for economic reasons, feel more of a stake at the table, feel that they're not being ripped off and cheated at every turn. I don't know to what extent that is feasible to accomplish, but I think that has to be the direction that one aims for.
I'm going to ask a question. Do you think that is more plausible at the national level or the local level?
I think it's more plausible to get things done at the local level. I think, frankly, that on a lot of the issues that I carry, if I look at poverty, then I think one of the reasons we don't achieve more is that we often start too late, and that we have to start with early childhood education. I don't think we're going to get anywhere with early childhood education at the federal level. At the state level, it's actually there is actually a lot being achieved. On mass incarceration has been a catastrophe in so many respects, not least for kids. Last week I was in Arkansas and Oklahoma, and in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, I met a kid who just got out of prison. At age 13, he was kicked out of the house by his mom's boyfriend. He was homeless. At 16, he robbed a pizza delivery man, then ran. He didn't get either the money or the pizza. He was caught. He was sentenced as an adult to 12 years in prison. He is illiterate. He could not read the form, the plea bargain that he was given, but he signed it. So he was sent to prison for 12 years, and he just got out after serving 9 of those years. Things like that, I think, have happened in, frankly, a lot of places around the country, and I think the cures for a lot of that injustice, the efforts to build real partnerships and get things done, I think are going to happen, particularly at the state level, to some degree at the local level, probably at least at the federal level.
I want to come back to the kind of theme of civility here, because John sort of charted a way forward for us, right? If we think about this as civility more than just how we talk with one another, but really embodying some of the aspirations that John described, sort of the very idea behind what you've put forward in Confident Pluralism is that as Americans, we can and must live together with these, in spite of these deep and sometimes irreconcilable differences over politics, religion, and the list goes on, and sort of other important matters. You suggest that if we don't do this, we will experience what you ended with, sort of this idea of the American nightmare. I'd like each of you to speak to a little bit about what's at stake if we don't actually find a way forward.
Well, so a book I read lately, which many of you might have come across as well, is J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. And to me, the most haunting line in that book, and there are many, is when he says his people, where he comes from, have no more heroes. And they don't see this country as for them at all. And so when we think of communities, and this actually cuts across geographies and demographics and lots of other things, we think of entire communities that have lost heroes and lost hope and lost a sense of belonging with this country, then a lot is at stake, right? And a lot is already at stake existentially in their lives, and it will hit the rest of us soon too. And so what's at stake is our ability to hold this thing together. And in the nod I made to the possibility of violence in my comments was not just for rhetorical power, that there is, we ought not take for granted that we have found alternatives to violence in most cases, and continuing that is at stake.
Do you have other pieces to add to thinking about this, kind of what's at stake?
What the nightmare looks like?
Yeah,
you mean?
what the nightmare looks like.
So I'm from rural Oregon, a town called Yamhill, Oregon, where the Willamette Valley rolls into the coastal range, and it's an area that was based on manufacturing, logging, farming. The economy's fallen apart. People have self-medicated. There's been enormous strains. There's been a wave of immigration, largely Mexican Americans. The white community tends to be deeply resentful of those immigrants. There have been these tensions that have been beneath the surface for a while. This year, with the election, they have been boiling. And so in one of the nearby towns, Forest Grove, a bunch of the white kids stood up in the middle of, I think it was chemistry class, and started chanting, "Build the wall, build the wall." A bunch of other students led a walkout. That school and actually a bunch of other schools there have been really torn apart that social fabric, resentments that were beneath the surface have poured out, and there haven't been fistfights, violence that I know of yet, but to me, kind of that is what is at stake, that the social fabric of my hometown, of my community, took generations to build up, feels like it's ripping. And I think that unless we sort this out in the coming months, it really will rip open.
I don't have any, yeah. The nightmare can go in either way, because you see, on the one hand, I could foresee, I could see white nationalism getting powerful and then creating real violence between the races. But I could also see, for example, a kind of cosmopolitan secularism marginalizing religious people, which is the other, another thing that I'm so glad Nick is willing to say is, another kind of prejudice. I mean, in England, up until the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, you couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge unless you were an Anglican. So if you were a Baptist, if you were Jew, if you were Catholic, you couldn't go, which meant it basically kept you out of the power. It kept you out of government jobs. It kept you out of, you had to be an Anglican or you just couldn't go in. Now, by the way, in the long run, that was terrible for Christianity. But the point is, if you would ever get to the place where all kinds of people, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, evangelical Christians, had views about moral and social issues that would mean you couldn't have a government job, you couldn't teach at Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, it'd be the same thing. And what Nick is saying is, you need everybody to get together to say, how are we going to reform the criminal justice system? How are we going to deal with childhood poverty? And actually, there's a fair amount of consensus on those things across those religious communities. But if anybody gets marginalized and just like, no, you can't work for us because of these views, then you are going to have little groups working on them, just like now, which you see. In other words, you'll have some people over here working on this, but there will not be any unity. And that's a tragedy, too. That might not be violence the way it might if the white nationalists win. But it would still be a tragedy. So I can see the nightmare kind of going in either direction. There's different kinds of nightmares, but there's still nightmares.
I think we're also losing our capacity for empathy, especially in the othering, and at some point that may become irretrievable. And so what does it mean as you were telling the story of the young man, I was thinking of audiences I've spoken to where there would be no empathy, right? It would immediately go to, well, what was his role in the problem, right? And in the other direction, there's little empathy for certain religious beliefs. And to start with the recognition that we're human beings, that we're somebody's son or daughter, when you see someone in pain, that their family's in pain too. And we do that less and less with people we see as different. And so they become caricatures or stereotypes or things we read about in the paper and not people. And when we do that long enough, we lose the capacity for empathy, I think.
Tim raised the idea of unity, right? And John, you spoke in your remarks to the sort of modest unity that you're looking for here. I want to kind of focus on that word for a minute, sort of the idea of being joined as part of a whole. And then the other word that goes along with that in your larger discussion around pluralism. So sort of a condition or a system in which many groups or principles or sources of authority coexist, to use your word. So your prescription, John, is for us to come together with our neighbors around what you call these three aspirations: tolerance, humility, and patience. Could each of you talk about how you see those particular aspirations helping guide us towards pluralism?
Tim?
Well, I already, by the way, said how John helped me retrieve tolerance now. I've recaptured it. I love it. I actually even like the way he defines humility. I do think that secular people often define humility as nobody knows who's got the truth. And then a lot of more traditional religious people, they don't like that part. So we know we've got the truth. Maybe you're agnostic, but I know I've got the truth. But the way John defines humility, which I think you could accept this across the board, not just religious people, non-religious people, is humility is recognizing, he already said it up here, but I'll say it again, recognizing the limits of what you can prove. To know that your views, though you are absolutely sure you're right, to know that your views are not empirically provable and are not self-evident to everybody, which means there's no way you can prove your views to all rational people, is an extremely important thing to keep in mind, because if you're a religious person, you've got to say, well, even if you got the truth, the fact is you're not going to be able to prove it to everybody. If you're a non-religious person, there is a tendency, this is my critique of my secular friends, there's a tendency for secular people to say, you have faith, but I just see things as they are. I'm just using my reason, and all reasonable people will see it this way. The fact, of course, is that all moral values are faith-based in a sense. They're not empirically provable. They're convictions. And so even if you're irreligious or non-religious or something like that, you ought to be able to say, even my views, I can't empirically prove to all rational people. That's humility. It doesn't mean uncertainty about your views. It just means humility, and that helped me enormously. And to me, once you get tolerance down, it's respecting people who've got views that are painful to you, without which we'll never work together, and B, humility, which is recognizing the limits of how much you can prove. Patience just comes from that. So that's, to me, the patience sort of flows out of the other two. And I know it can work, and I do think that we have enough desire to work together for, I'll put it this way, Charles Taylor, the great Canadian philosopher, says that there's not just believers and non-believers. Now, here he's talking about belief in God, okay? I know I'm going a little afield. He says there's people who believe in God, who are pressured, he calls them cross-pressured, and people who've got no doubts at all. A cross-pressured believer in God actually doesn't have personal doubts, but seems to understand why people would doubt. You're sympathetic to people who doubt. You get it. You see why they would doubt. Now, over here are the unbelievers, and you've got some unbelievers who just can't imagine why anybody would be so stupid as to believe in God. But then you have cross-pressured non-believers who say, I don't believe in God, but I see your point. I can kind of get it. Every so often, I even feel some of the strength of your arguments, though in the end, no. So he says cross-pressured believers and cross-pressured non-believers can easily get together and work on things. And it's actually a lot easier for them to be civil with each other. He says it's the believers who actually do think the other side is just absolutely stupid and kind of evil. And the non-believers who feel like the other side are stupid and kind of evil, that actually struggle a lot with confident pluralism. But Taylor makes the case that there's enough people on both sides of the divide, and that would be, I think you could push that on liberal conservative too. I think you could push it on religious and non-religious, that there's a core, and this goes against the idea that your ideas are doomed to immediate irrelevance. Right?
Forget that phrase.
That he would say around all these divides on traditional values and belief in God and all these things, that there's actually a core of people on both sides that can kind of sympathize with the other side a little bit, even if not too much, and can work together. And there's also a lot of people that just won't be able to be part of the program. But you don't need, I think, everybody involved, because especially at the local area you have some wins, the other states will say, hey, we can do that too. Okay, well, I mean, I wasn't able to stand up and talk. That's why it took a long time. That was kind of a long answer, but there we go. Getting my digs in.
Did you want to add anything about how the aspirations that John outlined help us move towards upholding pluralism?
I mean, I guess one point I would just add is that I think it's important to acknowledge that all this is hard work, that it's not just that one strips away, one's resentments or prejudices or anxieties. Now we're all kind of living in this panacea, that it really is hard work. And I've been fascinated by the work on unconscious bias. And if you haven't taken the implicit association tests, I really encourage you to. If you Google IAT, you can take them. And it basically turns out that we're all a bundle of biases, that we all have these irrational biases about race, about age, about body shape, about religion, and that these are irrational. We don't believe in them, but they are there. And so the problem with racism, for example, I think is not whites who deliberately discriminate, who don't believe in equality. Rather, I think the big problem is with well-meaning whites who believe in racial equality and yet act unconsciously in ways that perpetuate inequality. And when one talks about that, it's very easy to become defensive. I would never do that, but we all do that. And one of the studies that I found most fascinating in this regard, at the way we all are this bundle of unconscious biases, it involved the NBA, and some UPenn economists looked at personal fouls called in the NBA. And it turns out that refs in the NBA, incredibly well-trained, monitored by coaches, by audiences, they are more likely to call personal fouls on a player of a different race. And you think, if that's true in the NBA, what hope is there for all of us? And yet there's an aftermath. There's a postscript. The NBA, when that study came out, it got a lot of attention. This was about 10 years ago. The NBA was furious. It commissioned its own totally bogus study to show that there was no racism with personal fouls.
Social science.
But it triggered a lot of discussion among refs, among players, among everybody else. And then some years later, the original economists went back and did a study using the same methodology that they used the first time. And they found that this time, that discrepancy, that disparity had gone away. And it seemed that once the refs were aware of their bias, they were able to overcome it. And I do think that in a larger sense, whether our bias involves race or ethnicity or religion or gender, whatever it may be, that if we're willing to search deeply, acknowledge our own failings, look in the mirror and have really honest discussions with ourselves, then that can be the beginning of a process that results in a fairer judging of others and less otherizing, and perhaps to that greater civility that we aspire to.
Well, the one thing I'd say about that, though, is I think it is unlikely to work if it's just about me doing the soul searching and figuring it out. So we need other people, and we need contexts and institutions to push us in that direction. Notice I referred to these three as aspirations, and I originally wanted to call them practices or virtues, but actually those take work and those take time. And so I'm trying to buy some time with aspirations to get us to think about it, but I think that ultimately needs people coming together to practice with each other on these things. It's hard. I think you're exactly right. This is not easy. It's when I've been on Twitter for a couple of years, and I think my snarky intuitions, I could be really good on Twitter with the first cut, but I seldom actually send those tweets, right? So I pull back and angst and mull and never send it, and then send something kind of vanilla like, here's a good article. And but that actually, but there's maybe some value to that, right? Particularly in the social media space, and for me, it takes a lot of work to get there.
John, you brought up something really important that I want to pick up on for our last question, and we'll take some questions from the folks who are here. This idea of institutions, particularly, that are going to help propel this forward and really be a place where we do this hard work together. So you're all authors, you're all public intellectuals. People care about what you think. They paid money to be here to do it. They're watching at home tonight. Yet you possess expertise in areas where you sort of sit in different spots, right? We have a legal scholar, a pastor, and a journalist on the stage who are, speaking from legal institutions, religious institutions, and the institutions of the media. I'm not asking you to be the sole voice for those institutions. I'm asking you to think about those institutions and sort of what are the role that these different institutions play in providing both inspiration and instruction for addressing these deep divisions in our society?
Well, the law, I think, requires a kind of belief that it's working and a confidence in the law. And so part of what lawyers and judges and people who write about the law can do is strengthen the sense that this is, for the most part, working. And when you think about, just for example, Supreme Court nominations in the last 20 years, it doesn't matter which party or which judge. As soon as someone is nominated, that person is, right, an activist, ideologue who knows nothing about the law and is just trying to advance an agenda, when in fact most of these people are actually pretty good judges and pretty good lawyers. That's how they got there in the first place. And when we sort of critique and weaken the institutions, that's not to say that law is above politics. It's not. That'd be naive to say. But a lot of law actually functions as law, and a lot of good people at local levels and national levels are doing good law. And if we give up on that, then we're really in trouble. And so I think part of the reason that I teach law is because I believe law is a thing, right? I haven't walked over a cliff and to the point that law is just whatever the people in power want to say it is. And I want my students who are going to be lawyers to believe that as well. And that doesn't mean your arguments always win. That doesn't mean you always find justice. But it means that you are participating in a system in which you believe and that makes the world a less violent place than it would otherwise be.
So what can the media do, Nick?
I think the media could play an enormously important role in, at least two respects. One is holding accountable those who lead the waves of otherizing or of bigotry, whatever it may be. And the other is to humanize groups that tend to be prone to being marginalized, disenfranchised. We haven't historically done a good job of that, and I'm afraid that if you think we did a bad job in the last 20 years, we as a media collectively, then I'm afraid we're going to do a worse job in the next 10 or 20. And the reason is essentially that the business model of traditional journalism has largely collapsed. Everybody is desperate for audiences. And how do you build an audience? If you're executive producer of a TV show, what do? You hold it on a press conference by, say, a demagogue. I'm speaking purely randomly, of course. But the reason that television this spring completely passed the mic to Donald Trump was that he boosted ratings. He was the business model for cable TV this spring, and it worked. And having a bunch of people afterward to provide fact-checking commentary was not a useful part of that business model. Likewise, you can do, if you're an executive producer, you can go and send a camera crew off to report on, Muslim communities, Muslim families, or whatever other group is marginalized, and your ratings will go down. And so, I hate to say this because I became a journalist because I deeply believe in this profession's capacity to do good. I think that at its best it can do extraordinarily good work. But given the pressures of the business model, I'm afraid that those kinds of efforts may be more erratic and less reliable than they historically have been, and that the low barriers to entry that lead to the sort of alternative websites coming up may result in the media as a whole being more a part of the problem and less a part of the solution in the long run. Boy, that was depressing to say.
Obviously, what could the church do? Oh my goodness! Well, that could be another whole time. In fact, after all this, we're meeting in a church building, and frankly, we probably ought to have a follow-up just to talk about that, because so many of you probably are, would consider yourself Christian believers. But really, in a nutshell, maybe people could ask more questions so we don't, kill the time we have for questions. But here's the good news. I think the church, unlike I think Nick was really honest and to say that right now there's a lot against the media being a help in this, just because of the business model problems. The church could go either way, but here's the good news. I like to talk about what could be good. What's good is, this is going to be too fast. One of the things that's good is the old idea of the last 150 years of the national church is dying. You know the national church idea? I'm Norwegian, they're from Lutheran. I'm Italian, they're from Catholic. I'm that kind of thing. I'm Scottish, therefore I'm Presbyterian. The idea of the national church, which says this is the religion of this particular nationality, I'm glad that's dying. I hope you know that Christianity has gone more global than any other religion, and there's terrific possibilities here. What I mean by that is 80% of Muslims still live in South Central and Southeast Asia. 80% of Buddhists live still in Far East Asia. 90% of Hindus live in India. But if you take the continents, Europe, Africa, North America, Latin America, South America, and Asia, between 15 and 25% of all world Christians are in every one of those continents. So Christianity is the only religion that's actually really, truly spread. And what that means, of course, as many of you know, there's more, by the way, Presbyterians today in Ghana than there are in all of America and Scotland put together. There's more Anglicans in Uganda than there are in all of North America and Britain put together. And that's just Uganda. And by the way, Nigeria has 4 times more Anglicans than Uganda does. And when you begin to realize that, what you realize is Christianity actually could be, if the white Christian leaders who still dominate the world because of their money, if they really said, you know what, the voices of the Christian world we really need to make sure that all of our spokespersons are across the spectrum. Christianity actually is not, because you've got Christians and strong Christians, Christianity is a cross-ethnic, cross-class identity. So you're a Christian first and you're white or black second. You're a Christian first and you're rich or poor second. It always has been that. From the very beginning, Christianity invented a religious identity that was not just an extension of your class or racial identity. And if Christians could recapture that and actually talk to each other, then we would actually have lots of Christians in both political parties, lots of them. We do now, but they're not talking to each other. And so the idea that Christianity could be itself a bridge builder that would be a good model for other races and other classes that can't get together. Christians who are both black and white, instead of being divided in the Republican Democratic Party, need to stop being messianic about their own parties and thinking the other party is the evil one, and actually start to get together and say, how can we do bipartisan things? We want to do it with not just with Christians. We want to do it with everybody. But the fact is, we could begin the bipartisan. We could because of our common faith, we should be able to do things across the aisle. So if Christianity really stopped being fragmented in their national churches and began to practice itself as by the way, Pentecostal Christians are the most multiracial, multi-class human organization in the world right now. Pentecostal Christians are by far the most, they are bringing people together that otherwise never get together. It's not frankly, normal Protestantism versus Pentecostalism, mainstream Protestantism versus Pentecostalism, secularism. Nobody can light a candle to Pentecostal's multiracial makeup. We need to be willing to say, Christianity itself, if we're willing to listen to each other, empower non-white leaders, make sure the spokespersons of Christianity are also non-white people. First of all, Christianity you wouldn't be able to stick it right as they are right now, putting it into a particular political bucket. So Christians actually could model bipartisan work. Christians could model racial reconciliation, and not to the exclusion of people who aren't Christian, frankly, not at all, but just as a way of saying, hey, look, it can be done. So on the other hand, unlike the media, I would say we could go either way, because there's no doubt about it, because you saw it in Africa during the and you actually even saw it in Northern Ireland. Sometimes religion becomes the tool of the nationality. I mean, sometimes people, used their religion as a way of pushing your own racial agenda. It's happened all over the world constantly, and that's one of the reasons why secular people don't trust Christianity or religion in general. But if Christians can overcome that, oh my gosh. We really could, in some ways, be I hope, non-paternalistic leaders in civility. Not showing the humility. So the possibilities are huge, and I went on too long. So there we are.
The legal profession is looking pretty good now after that.
I'm just trying to say there's huge potential within global Christianity, not don't say American evangelicals. Global Christianity has got astonishing resources, and most people don't. Most people in America, both, by the way, religious and non-religious people, don't realize how globalized Christianity has become. But they're coming. Many people from the non-Western world are coming to the cities here, and that's one of the reasons why more and more urban Christian communities look so multiracial. We need to say, hey, we got to, we have to help the country and society by showing how we can overcome the divisions, at least within ourselves. But anyway, so.
Thank you. All right, we're going to turn to some of your questions. One of the cool things about this is I can see how many times this question's been texted. It's a lot. So, should incivility always be responded to with greater civility? What should we do when civility falls on deaf ears? What is the civil response to folks who hold the public square, the word is hostage, with their incivility?
Put them in jail. I wasn't going to answer that, so I thought I'd make a joke.
Well, I think part of the legal concept of the public forum, that space where we allow lots of voices to be heard on their own terms and to say their own ideas, it presupposes and actually requires the capacity for multiple voices to be heard. And so when actually someone takes hostage the entire public square and shuts down the possibility of others to speak, then the law can come in and regulate that. And so similarly in our own spaces, when we see that happening, there has to be a point at which one's own exercise of engagement or dialogue or non-dialogue shuts down the conversation so much that we have to be able to say that's too far. On the other hand, I do think maybe all of us, or certainly I could stand to receive incivility a little more and to have just a bit of a thicker skin about it, or to recognize that when someone calls me a name or doesn't like something I've written, that I don't have to, I can, maybe wonder, well, what was behind that comment, or try to exercise the empathy that I'm talking about. And that means sometimes taking incivility in a way that doesn't immediately turn it off. And in some ways, I think we're quick to be offended, and we could slow that down a bit.
Another one?
I think I agree with that. I think that's almost, that the easier problem is if somebody wants to shut down the public forum completely. I think the harder problem is things like hate speech, where somebody intrudes into a public forum and says things, make comments that freeze the discussion and impair an exchange of views, but don't actually completely shut things down. And I think that's a really hard problem in a democratic society. But I don't know that, but efforts to address that by regulating hate speech seem to me generally pretty unsuccessful. And I think one should be careful to avoid remedies that are worse than the problem. So on balance, I think that hate speech, that it's probably better to tolerate it, acknowledging its chilling effect, and respond with speech rather than with regulations.
Mm-hmm.
My magic device here tells me that this question has been asked a lot. How can we think about undoing the damage to our culture that Trump's campaign has done? Lots of people asking this question. I'm so glad I'm the moderator right now.
One can if he loses overwhelmingly, then I think it is possible. I think the future is very, very hard to predict, but I think if he loses by a large margin, it is quite plausible that other Republicans will distance themselves from him, that he will be tarred, that people will move in other directions, that the Republican Party will genuinely push for the kind of inclusiveness that it talked about 4 years ago, and that maybe, things could have ended up in a quite different direction. If Marco Rubio had been the nominee, we would not be having much of this conversation. Things can move in different directions. I don't think all this was written in stone. And after all, it was only 4 years ago that we had the remarkable situation of the son of a African villager competing against a Mormon for president. And things have come, these days they seem a lot more depressing, but things can change, and it seems to me that would be rather more likely to happen if there is a very decisive rejection of Trump.
On the Christian side, I'll tell you, actually, Nick's column yesterday came close to something I've been trying to say to some people, and that is that whereas the Christians I know who are largely non-white in the Democratic Party, when I mean by Christians, I mean Christians, small o, Orthodox, Christians with traditional understandings of the Bible and moral values and that sort of thing. So non-white, Orthodox, small o Christians in the Democratic Party, they're not, they're not naive. They see the Democratic Party is not the way to save the world, but it's a way to get good things done. And they recognize that they don't like a lot of elements of their own party platform and that sort of thing. But I have found, and so they usually are kind of non-white, I guess I could say non-white conservative Christians, and they're in the Democratic Party. However, conservative Christians who are usually white in the Republican Party have been naive. And they have had a tendency to say the only way to save the world is for the Democrats to lose. And so they have been more messianic about their own party. Christians in the Republican Party have been more messianic about the party than Christians in the Democratic Party. Now, by the way, I know a lot of secular liberal people in the Democratic Party who are very messianic about the Democratic Party and who really think that the basically the only way to save the world is to defeat the evil Republicans. But generally, Christians in the Democratic Party have not been messianic. Christians in the Republican Party have been, and I think that's over. I actually do think Trump actually has been a help. What was your title? What was the title of your column? Do you even remember? It was yesterday.
Trump, something about creating an opportunity.
What was it?
Building bridge.
What was it? Trump. What was his headline?
Can Trump help build bridges?
Can Trump bridge the God gap?
Can Trump bridge the God gap? Very good.
Yeah. By the way.
He had divine help.
I don't know. I don't know what I preached last Sunday either. But anyway, I actually think that it might help, because I actually think that I do know a lot of people who are in the Republican Party who are, traditional Christians who I don't think will leave the party, but they just do not have the same. I think they're, in some ways, the underbelly of their party has been revealed to them. I think they were naive. I know that. We were at a meeting not too long ago where a lot of those folks said that they feel like they have also lost some of they might have been naive about certain elements. So I actually do think that might help the God gap. I don't think it necessarily means all the Christians who are in the Republican Party will leave at all, because ultimately it's good to have a two-party system in which one party is more for smaller government and more for private enterprise, and one party is more wary of private enterprise. And most countries, there's there's a place for a spectrum of opinion about that, and it's good to have opposition. It's good to not only have your way. So I hope we still have a two-party system, but I actually do think Christians in the Republican Party are going to be less naive about it, and I think that's good. So in that way, Trump actually helps, I think.
I think I have two thoughts. One is that for the image that many of us have of the typical Trump voter, the picture that's on the news article, or the Saturday Night Live skit this weekend, Black Jeopardy with the Trump voter, which is actually a very empathetic sketch in some interesting ways, I think. But with a kind of compassion that doesn't sort of erase all faults here, but a kind of compassion that looks what is driving that voter, and can we get past a caricature or a poorly timed picture or something like that. So that's part of, I think, what healing has to look like. And then I think that there are opportunists that are political, religious, and otherwise in this election that have, at great risk to this country and to immigrants and to African Americans, and to a long list of that we could go down, have clamored for power and opportunity. And I hope that through the political process and in other ways that we hold them accountable for where they've taken us.
Thank you. Okay. Civility is obviously a really popular topic in this thought stream here. Folks would like to know if civility is only possible in people who possess virtues which are no longer sort of valued or held or taught. Is it possible? Is civility possible?
Fake it till you make it, right? I mean, you can pretend for a while, right? I mean, we can, sometimes pretending to be nice can lead you to be nice, and that's not nothing.
Well, that's the criticism of confident pluralism that he's gotten, and that is that we don't have a culture, or we don't have institutions. In fact, a good example of this is, and here, by the way, here's for those of you who are more conservative in your economics and politics, here's Nick saying that a more capitalistic approach to the media has actually brought about less civility, because the media basically knows, that is learned that the best way to get an audience and to be financially viable is to play to your particular slice. People want the me, was it me edition or the me?
The Daily Me.
The Daily Me. And so what's happened, of course, is that I mean, that's not helped the civility thing at all. And so all I know is that if you, so the people who are trying to say an individualistic, from the liberal point of view, is expressive individualism, therapy, everybody has to be themselves. The conservative point of view is the free market, capitalism, free enterprise without any kind of regulation. Both of those essentially do not create dispositions or virtues of civility. In other words, they basically, the idea of coming together and listening to each other and being respectful. So you could actually say there's a kind of conservatism and liberalism that both undermine civility, and therefore the critique of confident pluralism by people like that famous reviewer who said he was going to be irrelevant is to say we don't have institutions that create people who can do that anymore. The only thing I can say is that's one thing the church ought to say to the whole world, is we're committed to creating people who can do tolerance, humility, and patience. And James K.A. Smith, who's a philosopher, who's a friend of John and mine, recently wrote an article saying if there's anything the church could do to recommend itself to the world right now, is to say we want to become a place where we form people like that. But I don't know whether that's enough, frankly. So, and besides that, the church is a long way from forming people like that. Just because 2 or 3 people say let's do it doesn't mean we're doing it. So it's a problem. It's a big problem. It's the main reason why we might not have a good outcome to all the things we're talking about.
One nice thing, though, is the bar for civility is so low right now that it actually...
To increase it 10% would be like nothing.
it wouldn't take much to stand out and be above average here, right? So I think about... I I just realized this is being live streamed, so if you're listening in St. Louis, disregard this. But I think about when my kids go to sports practice or something like that. And back when I was a kid, parents, because they would be so bored, would actually start talking to each other. And now everyone's on our phones and actually not talking. But I guess I could say, hey, let's all have dinner at my place this weekend. And I haven't done that, but those sorts of small acts could be a step towards civility with people I don't know. I'm not promising that. But it would be a nice step.
I've offered all these sort of pessimistic takes, so let me say something optimistic.
Good.
I do think that one force, especially at a global level, but maybe to some degree at a national level, for this kind of tolerance for civility, is education. At a global level, literacy. For all of human history, until the 1960s, a majority of adults were illiterate. Since the 1960s, the tide has turned. Now about 85% of all adults worldwide are illiterate. The difference that makes in how people perceive the world and how they interact with each other is enormous. In this country as well. In about 1970, you had the proportion who were earning high school degrees basically froze. And just in the last half dozen years or so, it's going up again. There does seem to be a broad recognition in every sector of society that building human capital, improving educational outcomes is good for your kids, is good for society. And I do think that if we can improve educational outcomes, both domestically and internationally, that creates the capacity for more civil interactions.
There's a whole stream here in these questions about really practical ways to break down this sort of barrier, whether that's the barrier we have where we're only interested in the daily me, whether that's a barrier we have where we're not actually face-to-face with people talking about our differences. And the whole question, particularly of social media, is that if that is a public forum that exists, how do we engage people who are unlike us in there? So folks asking for practical recommendations for what can we do? Social media, get out of the daily me, get in face-to-face conversations together.
Fight the daily me, and just seek out real intelligent views that differ from yours. And that doesn't mean these sort of fake news, but intelligent people whom you respect, who have a very different worldview, and who not just have a different worldview on the things that you think are important, but have a different worldview about what is important. I think that on social media, I would say that's a way of breaking down the daily me. On Facebook, on Twitter, subscribe to sites that will challenge you. And then when you're tweeting something indignant, that remember that it always goes over better if you tweet something self-deprecating rather than insulting. Just something I've learned the hard way.
I had such admiration for when Nick said that if he's going to write something negative about somebody or critical of somebody, that you maybe call them up or let them know about it. Even that, though you're not talking face-to-face, that immediately, in a sense, humbles and chastens you, because here I've had interaction with a person. This person could come back at me. I've told them about it. Honestly, the more face-to-face you are, even if you're face-to-face, you're going to be more civil than if you're on the phone. If you're on the phone, you're going to be more civil than if you're writing a letter or emailing. Actually, frankly, you're more civil in a letter than an email. We all know that, because email is fast and you're hot under the collar and the person's not in front of you. Even if you had, in the old days, I'm old enough to remember writing letters. Do you remember writing letters? And actually, by the time you were done with the letter, you'd already calmed down. And honestly, seriously, you can go all the way from tweet to Facebook to email to. The closer you get to the way things always were done, the more likely you are to be civil. So actually, that's why the local is so important. National, state, yeah, but the local, and it feels to me like the activists of various groups and the representative of various racial groups and ethnic groups really ought to be talking together face to face in local neighborhoods. There's nothing like it. There's no substitute for that.
And I think to start by focusing on the ordinary acts and conversations that can build a foundation for the harder, more substantive talks. So I think of my kids' school in St. Louis, and we have, it's probably 30% African American, and we have these conversations about race and criminal law enforcement in St. Louis. And we didn't start there. We didn't just sit down in a room full of strangers and say, let's talk about race, because that doesn't go very well. But we started by learning each other's names and having our kids play together, and then over time saying, yeah, we do have some really hard issues, and can we start to talk about those? And so just sometimes kind of common sense in human nature about wanting people to be known before you critique or attack or even question a certain viewpoint, that can be helpful. And then I think particularly in the spaces and times in life where we have the capacity to slow down and to ask follow-on questions, and college is great for this. Right? Take a risk in college to find someone who's quite different than you, or to take a class you would never take. You won't have those opportunities in other phases of life. So to use the times you have with other people and other ideas to challenge yourself. And then I think this is sort of a point I make in the book, if you really are, the people who are most confident in their own beliefs ought to be the ones taking the most risks, because you want to be challenged in questions about what you think, and you're able even playfully sometimes to enter into challenging conversations because you are confident in what you believe.
Good. Thank you all for your time tonight. We're really grateful for you joining us.